In the shadows of crowded streets and smoke-filled back rooms, one man rewrote the rules of power without ever holding public office or wearing a uniform. Born into poverty, surrounded by violence and raised on survival, he learned early that control was more valuable than force. While others fought over corners and territory, he built systems, alliances, and invisible networks that stretched across cities and oceans. He turned chaos into structure, rivalry into cooperation, and crime into organized enterprise. His name traveled through whispered conversations and sealed envelopes, shaping an underground economy that rivaled legitimate corporations. This is the story of how strategy replaced brute strength, and how one mind reshaped an entire underworld. The story of Lucky Luciano is one of both intrigue and power, a narrative that spans across decades and continents, embodying the very essence of the American dream and its dark, twisted underbelly. But what makes Luciano's life truly captivating isn't merely the rise and fall of a gangster, it's the paradox at the heart of his story. A man who lived by the law of the underworld, yet understood better than anyone that crime at its core was a business. A man who started from nothing, and yet became a figure who would forever change the course of organized crime in America and beyond. As we journey through the story of Lucky Luciano, we'll witness not just the external events that shaped his life, but also the psychological complexity of his character. Luciano's genius lay in his ability to manipulate the system, to bend the criminal underworld to his will, while simultaneously playing the roles of both the cold, calculating businessman and the dangerous, ruthless gangster. He understood the nature of power, loyalty, and betrayal in ways that few others could. But this understanding didn't come without a price, as Luciano's story is also a tragic one that shows the costs of such ruthless ambition and unrelenting determination. Born in 1897 in the slums of the Lower East Side of New York City, Luciano's early life was a harsh one, marked by poverty, violence, and the kind of survival instincts that would later shape his future decisions. His family, like many others in the immigrant communities of New York at the time, struggled to make ends meet. They were among the millions who had come to America seeking a better life, but found instead the bitter reality of a society that often marginalized and exploited them. Luciano's mother, a Sicilian immigrant, would later become a key figure in shaping his understanding of loyalty, family, and honor, the very principles that would underpin the Mafia's code of conduct. From an early age, Luciano exhibited signs of a sharp mind, though his academic potential was stifled by his circumstances. School wasn't an option for young Salvatore, as he was forced to grow up quickly, learning how to fend for himself in a harsh world. By the age of 14, Luciano was already immersed in the world of petty crime, stealing from local stores and working for the small-time criminals who ran the streets. But even in these early days, something about Luciano stood out. He wasn't just a thug looking to make a quick buck. He had a keen understanding of how the world worked. He knew that it wasn't enough to be tough. You had to be smart. You had to outthink and outmaneuver your opponents if you wanted to survive in this world. And this realization would be the cornerstone of his future success. As Luciano grew older, he began to move into the world of organized crime, where he quickly gained the attention of more established figures in the underworld. His rise wasn't the result of mere chance. It was the result of his relentless ambition, his uncanny ability to navigate the complex web of alliances and betrayals that defined the criminal world. Luciano understood that in order to succeed in this game, he would need more than just muscle. He needed connections, strategy, and an unwavering commitment to his vision. In the rough and unforgiving world of organized crime, Luciano began to make a name for himself by aligning with some of the most influential figures in the business. By the 1920s, Luciano had become an important figure in New York's criminal landscape, particularly in the world of bootlegging, which had exploded in the wake of Prohibition. But Luciano was not content with just running a few illicit liquor operations. He saw an opportunity to transform the Mafia from a collection of loosely affiliated gangs into a well-organized and profitable criminal empire. His vision was clear. He didn't just want to be another gangster making a quick profit. He wanted to be the architect of a new kind of crime organization, one that operated with the efficiency of a corporation. Luciano's idea was revolutionary. He would unite the various Italian-American crime families under one umbrella, bringing together rival factions that had spent years fighting each other for control of New York streets. At the heart of this new structure would be a centralized leadership, a commission, that would settle disputes between the families and ensure that power was distributed in a way that minimized violence and maximized profits. It was a risky move, but Luciano's understanding of human nature told him that the only way to prevent constant bloodshed in the underworld was to create a system that rewarded cooperation over conflict. He knew that the future of organized crime lay not in raw power or violence, but in organization, strategy, and, above all, loyalty. The establishment of the commission marked the beginning of a new era for the Mafia. With Luciano at its helm, the Mafia grew into a tightly knit, highly profitable organization that controlled everything from gambling and extortion to unions and construction. Luciano's empire wasn't just about crime, it was about making money, and doing so in a way that minimized risk and maximized reward. The years of bloodshed and chaos that had plagued the underworld for so long were gradually replaced by a more orderly, efficient system that kept violence to a minimum, but ensured that everyone from the lowest foot soldier to the most powerful don received their fair share of the profits. But while Luciano's innovations in crime were revolutionary, they also came with their own set of challenges. The Mafia's success inevitably attracted the attention of law enforcement, and by the late 1930s, Luciano's empire was under intense scrutiny from the government. The FBI, led by the ambitious J. Edgar Hoover, made it their mission to bring down the most powerful crime figure in America. The net began to close around Luciano, and his once unshakable empire began to show signs of weakness. The eventual downfall of Lucky Luciano was the result of a combination of factors: betrayal, greed, and the unrelenting pressure from law enforcement. In the end, it was a carefully orchestrated scheme involving both internal and external forces that would bring Luciano to his knees. But even as his empire crumbled, Luciano's understanding of power and his ability to adapt to new circumstances remained intact. His eventual arrest and conviction in 1936 marked the end of one chapter in the Mafia's history, but it also solidified Luciano's place in the criminal pantheon, forever cementing his reputation as one of the most influential figures in the history of organized crime. Luciano's legacy is one of complexity, both as a businessman and as a criminal mastermind. His story reflects the contradictions that defined him: a man who valued loyalty yet betrayed those closest to him, a man who saw crime as a business but was willing to sacrifice everything for power. And perhaps most telling of all, Luciano's legacy is a testament to the dark, destructive nature of ambition. For while Luciano built an empire that endured for decades, his rise to power was ultimately as much about personal ambition as it was about his desire to control the Mafia. It was this drive that would shape the course of his life, leading him to build an empire that would ultimately be his undoing. The story of Lucky Luciano is not just a tale of crime and power, it is a reflection of the human condition, the complex interplay between ambition, loyalty, betrayal, and the insatiable desire for control. It is a story of a man who reshaped the underworld in his own image, but whose own downfall was just as inevitable as the rise of the empire he built. And in that, there is both tragedy and triumph, a duality that makes Luciano's story one of the most captivating and enduring in the annals of organized crime history. Before Lucky Luciano came into the scene, the world of organized crime in America was chaotic, fragmented, and full of brutal competition. The streets of New York and many other urban areas across the country were dominated by criminal gangs, each vying for power and control over their territories. The Mafia, as it existed at the time, wasn't the highly organized, efficient machine that Luciano would later build. It was a patchwork of small-time criminals and independent gangs, constantly at war with one another. There was no real unity, no system, just a raw, violent struggle for dominance. For those who lived in these neighborhoods, survival was about more than just avoiding the law. It was about protecting one's turf from rival criminals. At this point in time, the Mafia in America was still largely driven by old-world traditions, influenced heavily by the Sicilian roots of its leadership. The Mafia structure was less like a business empire and more like a loose confederation of criminal families, each with their own ambitions and rivalries. The loyalty between the families was often tenuous, and infighting was rampant. The underworld was rife with corruption, but it was also inefficient. Instead of a collective force, the different gangs fought for dominance in a way that often made them more vulnerable to law enforcement and rival factions alike. It was in this world of fragmentation and conflict that Luciano saw an opportunity for change. The rise of prohibition in the early 1920s was a game-changer for organized crime. As alcohol was banned across the United States, the demand for illegal liquor soared. This created an incredibly lucrative market for those who had the means to supply it. Bootlegging quickly became the backbone of the American criminal economy, and many of the existing crime families jumped on the bandwagon. But even in the midst of this unprecedented opportunity, the criminal landscape remained divided. Different factions controlled different neighborhoods, and competition for control over liquor distribution became cutthroat. The fight for dominance turned into a battle for survival, and it became increasingly clear that the disarray and lack of coordination within the criminal underworld could only lead to more bloodshed and inefficiency. Luciano, at the time a young, ambitious gangster, recognized this problem and knew that the only way for organized crime to truly thrive was through unity. He understood that while the old ways might have worked for some, they would not suffice in the rapidly changing world of prohibition. He was different from the old-school mobsters who relied on brute force and territorial control. Luciano was a pragmatist, a businessman at heart, and he saw organized crime as a complex, multifaceted industry that needed structure to reach its full potential. He also saw the cracks in the old ways. The Sicilian-dominated Mafia was often at odds with other ethnic groups involved in organized crime, including Jews, Irish, and others who had made their mark in the criminal world. The tension between these groups often led to violence and internal conflict, weakening their collective power. Luciano was one of the first to recognize that the solution wasn't more infighting, it was cooperation. This vision was radical, and it marked the beginning of his rise to power. Luciano's plan was simple, but it would take a unique blend of vision, manipulation, and strategic thinking to pull it off. He believed that if he could unite the major crime families under a single leadership structure, the Mafia would become an unstoppable force. Instead of each family fighting for control, Luciano would create a centralized system where the families could share resources, settle disputes through negotiation, and ultimately work together for mutual profit. This wasn't just about making money, it was about creating a stable, self-sustaining system that could withstand the pressures from law enforcement, rival gangs, and even the political establishment. This idea wasn't universally accepted at first. Many of the old mobsters, especially the ones with deep Sicilian roots, resisted the idea of a more centralized power structure. They were used to the old ways, running their own families, making their own rules, and settling disputes with violence if necessary. But Luciano wasn't easily deterred. He was a master of persuasion, and he used his charisma and tactical brilliance to bring key players into his fold. One of his greatest assets was his ability to identify and form alliances with other ambitious, like-minded individuals. He reached out to people like Meyer Lansky, who was also keen on creating a more organized, profitable criminal empire, and to Frank Costello, a figure who would later become one of the most influential men in the Mafia's rise to power. The critical moment came when Luciano gathered the heads of the major Mafia families to establish the Commission, a governing body that would oversee the operations of the entire American Mafia. The Commission would act as a mediator, resolving disputes between families and making decisions on business ventures that would affect the entire organization. The creation of the Commission marked the beginning of a new era in organized crime. Luciano's vision of unity, cooperation, and profit-sharing had become a reality. But the formation of the Commission didn't mean an end to the violence. Rivalry still existed, and Luciano had to contend with the challenges of keeping the peace. The violence was just different now, more controlled, more strategic. Instead of all-out wars between families, conflicts were now resolved in boardrooms and quiet meetings, where business deals were made and deals were struck in a far less public way. The old-world gangsters didn't disappear, they adapted to the new structure, accepting the Commission as the de facto authority in the Mafia world. In the early years of the Commission's existence, Luciano's influence grew rapidly. He continued to expand the Mafia's reach into new territories and industries. He moved beyond bootlegging, getting involved in gambling, narcotics, unions, and even labor racketeering. The structure he built allowed for the Mafia to operate like a multinational corporation, with each family specializing in a different criminal enterprise, but all operating under the same set of rules. Luciano's empire was built on a foundation of strategy, foresight, and an understanding that the underworld needed to evolve if it was to survive in an increasingly hostile world. Luciano's impact wasn't just limited to the business of crime. He was also a master of psychology. He understood human nature better than most, especially when it came to loyalty and fear. Loyalty in the Mafia wasn't just about respect, it was about survival. The Mafia thrived on the idea of omerta, the code of silence, and Luciano used this to his advantage. He made sure that everyone knew the rules: betray the family and you would pay the price. But he also understood that fear alone wasn't enough to keep people loyal. You had to give them a reason to stay loyal, a reason that went beyond just survival. He created an atmosphere where people knew that if they stuck with him, they would prosper. Those who crossed him, however, were swiftly eliminated. Through a combination of rewards and punishments, Luciano kept his empire running smoothly, making sure that everyone from the top to the bottom had something to gain by staying loyal to the cause. In this turbulent world, where loyalty was often fleeting and betrayal was always just around the corner, Luciano's rise was both inevitable and necessary. The fragmented world of the Mafia could no longer survive on its own. It needed a leader, someone who could think beyond the bloodshed and the violence, someone who understood that power wasn't just about strength but about organization and vision. Luciano was that leader. His genius was in his ability to transform the Mafia from a disjointed, violent mess into a well-oiled criminal machine, one that would stand the test of time. In a way, his story was as much about business as it was about crime. He didn't just build an empire, he reshaped the entire landscape of organized crime, and in doing so he left an indelible mark on history. From the chaotic streets of the Lower East Side of New York City, the early life of Salvatore Lucky Luciano is not the story of a child born into greatness, but of one forged by necessity. The son of Sicilian immigrants, Luciano's family faced the harsh realities of life in one of the toughest neighborhoods in America at the time. Their world was defined by poverty, the crushing weight of survival, and the constant sense of displacement that many immigrants felt in the early 20th century. Luciano was just one of many kids growing up in a world where crime was often the easiest path to power and respect. Yet even from a young age, something about him set him apart from the other boys in the street. As a child, Luciano didn't just learn how to survive, he learned how to read the world around him. His early exposure to street life, the thugs, the petty criminals, and the hustlers, instilled in him an acute understanding of how people behaved when their backs were against the wall. Unlike many of his peers who fought in the streets simply for survival, Luciano had a mind that was always working, always calculating. He didn't just see violence as a means to an end, he saw it as a tool that had to be used wisely and sparingly. His innate understanding of power dynamics, of what made people tick, of how they could be manipulated, controlled, or eliminated, would shape his future ambitions. His rise was inevitable, but it was not without obstacles. Luciano was not born with a silver spoon in his mouth, nor was he the son of a wealthy or influential family. His circumstances were a far cry from the privileged lives of other ambitious men of his time. He came from the kind of world where the only way out was through violence or cunning. His exposure to crime started early, but it wasn't the crime that shaped him, it was his vision. From the very start, Luciano wasn't interested in small-time theft or street-level gangs. He knew that the real power didn't come from petty crimes, it came from control, from organizing the chaos, from building an empire. This early recognition of what would be needed to succeed in the criminal world set Luciano apart from those who were merely trying to survive. By the time Luciano hit his teenage years, he had already made a name for himself in the small-time crime circles that populated the Lower East Side. He was drawn to the workings of the streets and the local gangs, but what set him apart was his ability to move between these worlds with ease. He wasn't just another thug. He was a businessman in the making, a young man with the uncanny ability to navigate the underworld with a sense of purpose and vision. He didn't just follow orders. He understood that the real power lay in giving the orders and being the one who pulled the strings. This early stage in Luciano's life was crucial in shaping his understanding of loyalty and power. Growing up in an immigrant family, he was constantly reminded of his outsider status. To survive in the world he inhabited, loyalty was everything. But loyalty was a currency that had to be earned, and Luciano learned quickly that loyalty wasn't about blind faith, it was about mutual benefit. This understanding of loyalty would become central to Luciano's operations in the years to come. His ability to read people, to know who could be trusted and who could not, became his greatest asset. It was this ability to cultivate loyalty, both from his own men and from those who were once his enemies, that would allow him to rise so quickly in the Mafia world. As a young man, Luciano began to realize that the real potential for power lay not in the local street gangs, but in the larger, more organized criminal families that controlled vast swaths of territory. These families, which included the Genovese, the Gambino, and the Lucchese, were more than just criminal outfits. They were businesses, and like any successful business, they needed leadership, structure, and organization. Luciano's ambition wasn't just to join one of these families. He wanted to reshape the entire Mafia landscape. At the age of 18, Luciano began to make strategic moves, aligning himself with key figures in the criminal world. He was able to quickly gain the trust of powerful figures such as Johnny Torrio, an influential gangster who would become a mentor to him. Torrio, who ran a large portion of Chicago's criminal activity, recognized the young Luciano's potential and took him under his wing. It was under Torrio's tutelage that Luciano began to develop the organizational skills that would later prove to be his greatest strength. Torrio showed him how the larger criminal organizations worked, not just on the streets but in the boardrooms and back rooms where business deals were made and fortunes were built. The mentorship that Luciano received from Torrio was invaluable, but it was also a turning point. It was under Torrio that Luciano began to understand that crime wasn't just about violence and intimidation. It was about control, organization, and making connections. Torrio's criminal empire was built on a combination of partnerships, alliances, and a steady stream of income from illegal activities like bootlegging, gambling, and labor racketeering. This was the type of business Luciano wanted to run, and Torrio's influence showed him how to make the leap from street thug to crime boss. But while Torrio's lessons were essential, they weren't enough to prepare Luciano for the battles he would have to fight in the years to come. The early 1920s were a time of intense rivalry among the various mafia families, and Luciano quickly realized that power in the criminal world wasn't something that could be handed to you, it had to be taken. The existing power structures were entrenched, and many of the mafia dons were reluctant to change the way things were done. But Luciano wasn't a man to be deterred by tradition or the status quo. He knew that to take control he needed to be both ruthless and innovative. He needed to think not like a gangster but like a businessman. In his early years as a young man, Luciano's reputation grew quickly. He started making moves, strategically placing himself in positions of power within the various criminal organizations. He formed alliances with other young ambitious mobsters, and slowly began to gather a group of loyal followers. But Luciano wasn't just a gangster with a growing following, he was a visionary, someone who saw the potential to create something far more powerful and organized than anything that existed at the time. He understood that the fragmented and violent world of the mafia was ripe for reorganization. It was this understanding that would ultimately propel him into the highest echelons of power. During this period, Luciano's confidence grew, and his ambition expanded. He was no longer content with merely running his own operations, he wanted to control the entire underworld. His vision for the mafia was radical: to unite the fractured criminal families under a single, centralized structure, with him at the top. He began making deals with other rising figures in the underworld, including Meyer Lansky and Frank Costello, who shared his vision of creating a unified mafia that would operate like a business rather than a series of independent fiefdoms. This vision would become the foundation of Luciano's eventual success, but it would also make him many enemies. The old guard, including those who controlled the Sicilian-dominated families, resisted Luciano's plans, preferring the chaotic and violent system that had served them for years. But Luciano wasn't deterred. He knew that if he could just outsmart his rivals and prove his vision, he would change the entire landscape of organized crime in America forever. Lucky Luciano's ability to see the potential in the mafia extended far beyond just his ruthless tactics and charisma. His true genius lay in his ability to reorganize the fragmented world of organized crime, seeing it not as a series of isolated criminal acts, but as a complex business that could be managed with the same precision as a corporation. While the previous generations of mobsters had been content to run their operations with brute force and small-scale turf wars, Luciano realized that the future of organized crime lay in collaboration, coordination, and efficiency. The chaos that reigned in the underworld prior to Luciano's rise was born from the fierce competition between the various crime families. The mafia wasn't a single unified entity, it was a collection of fragmented factions, each with their own leaders, their own codes, and their own territories. This lack of centralization created constant strife, making it difficult to expand operations, deal with law enforcement, or even control territory without brutal infighting. The result was a dysfunctional, inefficient system that allowed other, more organized criminal elements to grow. Luciano saw this as a fundamental flaw, one that he could exploit. From the very beginning, Luciano's vision was clear. He sought to create a system where the mafia was unified under one cohesive leadership, a system that would allow for peace and order within the organization. His approach to leadership was revolutionary in its simplicity: eliminate unnecessary violence, establish a hierarchy of power, and create a clear structure of operation where every family within the mafia could share in the profits, without stepping on each other's toes. To do so, he would need to establish a way of governing the mafia, a framework that would unite the various factions while keeping their interests aligned. His idea was to build a commission, a governing body that would oversee and regulate the operations of the 5 major mafia families. This commission would not only arbitrate disputes but also facilitate business dealings among the families, creating a standardized system that made it easier to negotiate deals, manage finances, and avoid unnecessary bloodshed. Luciano knew that a mafia with a centralized structure would be able to take advantage of the expanding opportunities in the criminal world, from bootlegging and gambling to labor racketeering and narcotics. He also recognized that this approach could help reduce the law enforcement pressure that had been growing in recent years. The FBI, under J. Edgar Hoover, had started taking a more aggressive stance against the Mafia, and Luciano understood that in order to survive, the Mafia would need to adapt to the changing times. In creating the commission, Luciano was essentially setting the stage for a new era in organized crime, one that was far more sophisticated and efficient than the previous methods of brute force and violence. The structure he envisioned would be a model of cooperation, where families could coexist and thrive together, under the watchful eye of the commission. But this new structure would not come easily. It required a delicate balance of power and influence, as well as a deep understanding of human nature. Luciano had to navigate not only the complex world of mafia politics but also the egos and ambitions of some of the most powerful crime bosses in America. The formation of the commission was a turning point in the history of organized crime. It wasn't just a political move, it was a business decision, a masterstroke that would allow Luciano to control the entire underworld without constantly resorting to violence. But it also required strategic alliances with other ambitious figures within the Mafia, such as Meyer Lansky, who was skilled in finance, and Frank Costello, who had a keen sense of how to operate behind the scenes. By forging these alliances, Luciano was able to create a network of powerful individuals who shared his vision for the future of the Mafia. These men, each with their own influence and expertise, became crucial to the success of Luciano's plan. They were the backbone of the new Mafia empire, and each played a key role in the operation of the commission. But Luciano's approach wasn't just about making deals and consolidating power, it was also about understanding the psychology of loyalty and trust. He knew that in order to maintain control over the Mafia, he had to create a system where loyalty was rewarded, but betrayal was punished harshly. The fear of retribution was a key component in the Mafia's ability to stay united, and Luciano used this to his advantage. He made sure that every member of the commission understood the consequences of betraying the organization, and he worked tirelessly to build a network of spies and informants to root out any potential threats to his power. This system of loyalty and fear became the foundation of Luciano's rule, allowing him to maintain control over an increasingly vast criminal empire. As Luciano solidified his power, his influence over the various Mafia families grew. Under his leadership, the Mafia began to operate like a well-oiled machine, with each family specializing in different aspects of the criminal enterprise. One family might control the bootlegging operations, while another controlled gambling and prostitution, and yet another focused on labor racketeering and unions. This division of labor allowed Luciano to expand the reach of the Mafia into virtually every aspect of the illegal economy, while minimizing internal competition and conflict. One of Luciano's most innovative ideas was his expansion into labor racketeering. He realized that labor unions were an untapped resource for making money, and by infiltrating and controlling these unions, the Mafia could generate massive profits. Luciano's connections in the labor movement allowed him to exert influence over key industries, from construction to the waterfront, ensuring that union leaders were paid off and controlled by the Mafia. This move not only generated huge sums of money for the Mafia but also provided a level of protection against law enforcement, as the unions became powerful political allies. Luciano's empire grew rapidly, and by the mid-1930s, he was one of the most powerful figures in the United States. His criminal operations spanned from coast to coast, and his influence extended far beyond the Mafia itself. He had forged relationships with corrupt politicians, businessmen, and law enforcement officers, ensuring that his empire was protected from any external threats. His vision had come to fruition, and the Mafia was now a powerful, well-organized institution, with Luciano at the helm. But while Luciano's empire was flourishing, his success didn't go unnoticed. The rise of the Mafia was threatening to the established power structures in America, and law enforcement, particularly the FBI, began to focus more intently on bringing Luciano down. The government, under the leadership of J. Edgar Hoover, had made it clear that it viewed the Mafia as a major threat to national security. As a result, Luciano found himself facing increasing pressure from law enforcement, who were determined to dismantle his operations. Despite his best efforts to avoid capture, the authorities eventually succeeded in bringing him to trial. The story of Lucky Luciano's rise to power is a testament to his ability to adapt and innovate in a world that was constantly changing. He didn't just rely on brute force or violence. He relied on his intelligence, his strategic mind, and his ability to see the bigger picture. By organizing the Mafia into a cohesive, efficient operation, Luciano was able to build an empire that was unprecedented in the history of organized crime. But his success came with a price. The very structure he had built to maintain order would ultimately become the target of those who sought to bring him down. Nevertheless, Luciano's genius as a criminal mastermind cannot be denied. His legacy would endure long after his fall, shaping the future of organized crime for generations to come. The Code of Omerta, the sacred law of silence, was the bedrock upon which the Mafia's power was built. It was more than just a set of rules, it was a psychological framework that governed every action, every decision, and every interaction within the Mafia. This code held the entire criminal enterprise together, ensuring loyalty, fostering fear, and creating a culture where betrayal was not only unacceptable but punishable by death. The Code of Omerta was as much about control as it was about survival, and for Lucky Luciano, it became an essential part of the structure he meticulously crafted for the Mafia. Omerta was not just a rule, it was an ideology, a way of life that shaped the Mafia's interactions with the outside world and its internal dynamics. To break the code was to invite disaster, not just for the individual who transgressed but for the entire organization. Loyalty was paramount in the Mafia, and it was through the adherence to this code that Luciano was able to build an empire that survived both from the inside and out. It was the lifeblood of the criminal organization, and for Luciano, maintaining the integrity of the code was key to holding together his sprawling underworld network. But Omerta, as it was applied under Luciano's reign, wasn't just about avoiding the law's attention or protecting oneself from retribution. It was a strategic tool, one that created an unbreakable psychological bond among the men who worked under him. Fear and loyalty were two sides of the same coin. To betray the Mafia was to risk not just your life, but the lives of those you loved and those who worked beside you. The system was designed so that no man could turn against the family without suffering irreversible consequences. Every action in the Mafia was tied to the central idea of loyalty, not just to the boss but to the structure that Luciano had created. It became a constant, pervasive influence that shaped every aspect of how the Mafia operated. Luciano understood that the loyalty demanded by Omerta wasn't something that could be enforced through fear alone. While the threat of retribution loomed large, the true power of the code lay in how it bound the men under him. Luciano was a master manipulator of loyalty. He knew that men who were made to feel indebted, men who believed they had a stake in the system, were far more likely to remain loyal than those who were merely afraid. He didn't just demand loyalty from his men. He cultivated it by rewarding those who were faithful to him and his vision. His genius lay in the understanding that loyalty, once given, was harder to take back, especially when it had been fostered through trust and mutual benefit. The bond of Omerta, while enforced by the threat of violence, was also a bond of mutual obligation, a two-way street. The Code of Omerta created a system of checks and balances within the Mafia. It ensured that those who stayed loyal would be rewarded, but it also ensured that those who stepped out of line would pay the ultimate price. Loyalty, however, was not a static thing. It was earned and maintained through consistent action, a shared understanding that everyone within the system was working toward the same goal. But as much as loyalty was encouraged, betrayal was equally feared. If loyalty created unity within the ranks, betrayal was the one thing that could bring it all crashing down. Luciano knew this all too well, and as his influence grew, so did his efforts to maintain the system of control that kept his empire running smoothly. To ensure the integrity of the Mafia, Luciano took steps to guarantee that the Code of Omerta was ingrained in every aspect of Mafia life. It was not simply something that was understood in the abstract. It was lived out every day. The fear of betrayal was a constant presence, ever lurking in the background, reinforcing the importance of silence and loyalty. Those who broke the code were not just cast out, they were erased. The Mafia was not a place for weakness, and the ultimate form of weakness in this world was betraying the organization. Luciano's control over the Mafia was built on this very foundation of fear and loyalty, and he expanded its influence through every level of his empire. The mobsters who worked for him didn't just see the Mafia as a way to make money, they saw it as a family, a structure that offered them power, respect, and security. But with these rewards came responsibilities. The code ensured that each individual was invested in the survival of the whole. There was no room for disloyalty, and the consequences for betrayal were dire. It was this unyielding control that allowed Luciano to keep his grip on power for so long. However, the code wasn't just about brute force, it was also about perception. Luciano recognized that the power of Omerta extended beyond the Mafia's inner circle. The code also influenced the way the public viewed the Mafia. By keeping silent about their operations, the Mafia was able to operate with near impunity. The code ensured that the authorities had little to no inside information about the criminal operations, which allowed Luciano to grow his empire without constantly worrying about law enforcement infiltrating it. Silence was as much a weapon as a way of life, and it kept the Mafia out of the reach of the law. One of the key elements of Omerta was its influence on the Mafia's interactions with outsiders. The Mafia didn't just control its own ranks, it controlled its dealings with the outside world through the unspoken rule that no one, not even the police, could penetrate the inner workings of the organization. The fear of betrayal was so ingrained that even the closest allies could not be trusted to speak out of turn. The code created a sense of paranoia but also a sense of security. As long as the code was adhered to, the Mafia would remain insulated from the outside world. It was a self-sustaining system, immune to the weaknesses that might otherwise allow outside forces to break in. Luciano also recognized that the Mafia was evolving, and with this evolution came new challenges. As his empire grew, he began to confront the changing landscape of organized crime, dealing with new forms of competition, new sources of income, and shifting alliances. But no matter how much the business of crime shifted, the code of Omerta remained constant. It provided a stable framework around which Luciano could build, adapt, and expand his empire. The code of silence was an essential part of his strategy for survival, as it allowed him to remain one step ahead of law enforcement and maintain control over the ever-expanding operations of the Mafia. The Mafia, under Luciano, operated like a well-oiled machine, and it was the code that kept the gears turning smoothly. It kept the structure intact, ensured loyalty, and prevented the organization from falling into chaos. Even when betrayal seemed inevitable, when conflicts arose within the organization, the code of silence provided the means to handle disputes without exposing the entire organization to risk. Luciano understood that the threat of retribution was not just about enforcing rules, it was about maintaining the integrity of the system itself. By making sure that every member of the Mafia knew that silence was the ultimate form of loyalty, Luciano ensured that no matter how much external pressure mounted, his organization would continue to thrive. However, it was the personal consequences of breaking Omerta that truly solidified its power. The notion of betrayal became so ingrained in the culture of the Mafia that it was no longer simply about fear of the boss, it was about the fear of the repercussions from the entire network. To betray the Mafia was to betray not just the boss but the entire brotherhood. This collective loyalty, coupled with the fear of the consequences, ensured that Luciano's reign remained relatively unchallenged for years. As long as Omerta was upheld, Luciano's control over the Mafia was absolute, and he would remain one of the most feared and respected figures in the underworld. Yet the code also had its weaknesses. As the stakes grew higher, as Luciano's empire expanded and his power grew, the very loyalty that the code demanded began to be tested. Betrayal became inevitable, and when it did happen, it exposed the cracks in the seemingly unbreakable system that Luciano had created. Even within the Mafia, no one was immune to temptation, and as much as Luciano tried to ensure that loyalty was maintained, he could not prevent the eventual betrayals that would come to define his fall. The Code of Omerta, while effective in keeping the Mafia together, also played a key role in the unraveling of the system. It was this very code that helped create a culture of secrecy, fear, and loyalty, a culture that would ultimately catch up with Luciano. For all its power, the code could not prevent the inevitable cracks in the empire that would eventually lead to his downfall. Still, as much as it contributed to the eventual erosion of Luciano's empire, Omerta remains one of the most enduring legacies of his reign, a testament to the power of loyalty, fear, and control in the world he built. In the world that Luciano created, crime was not just an illicit activity, it was a business, and like any successful business, it had to operate with efficiency and foresight. Luciano recognized early on that to succeed, the Mafia needed to evolve. It needed to operate as a corporation, complete with various departments, each specializing in its own criminal enterprise. While the old guard of the Mafia was content with smaller-scale operations and turf wars, Luciano's mind worked differently. He understood the value of diversification and centralization, seeing the potential to turn illegal activities into organized, profitable enterprises that could survive the scrutiny of law enforcement and political pressures. The business of crime wasn't just about surviving, it was about thriving, expanding, and maintaining power. Luciano's genius lay in how he saw the entire landscape of organized crime. He was more than just a thug or a criminal mastermind, he was an innovator, and his vision transformed the Mafia from a patchwork of small warring factions into a sleek, highly organized network of profitable enterprises. Under his leadership, the Mafia expanded into new territories and new avenues of crime, each of which was managed with a level of sophistication that had never been seen before. The core of Luciano's criminal empire was bootlegging. With the advent of prohibition in 1920, alcohol was suddenly illegal, and the demand for illicit liquor soared. This provided a huge opportunity for those who could navigate the black market, and Luciano was quick to capitalize on it. He didn't just dabble in bootlegging, he made it the centerpiece of his operations. Rather than simply smuggling alcohol into the United States, Luciano turned the operation into a massive, nationwide network. He brought in suppliers, distributors, and operatives from every corner of the country to make sure that his product was delivered in large quantities to every city and state. His operation wasn't just about getting alcohol into people's hands, it was about monopolizing the market, controlling the distribution, and ensuring that every part of the process was under his control. Luciano didn't just run a bootlegging operation. He ran a business that could rival any legitimate corporation. His distribution networks were carefully planned, with drivers, warehouses, and secure transport routes set up across the country. He knew that in order to avoid law enforcement detection, his operations needed to be as efficient and secretive as any legitimate business. To achieve this, Luciano relied heavily on trusted allies who ran the day-to-day operations for him, while he orchestrated everything from behind the scenes. His operations were not just run on violence and intimidation, they were run on strategy, foresight, and logistics. In addition to bootlegging, Luciano's criminal empire expanded into a number of other profitable industries. Gambling was one of the most lucrative illegal activities, and Luciano saw its potential early on. Rather than simply controlling street-level numbers rackets, Luciano sought to control entire gambling operations. He understood that the key to success in the gambling industry was to create a network of casinos, bookmaking operations, and other gambling outlets that could provide steady, untraceable income. His gambling operations spread across the country, from the bustling streets of New York to the neon lights of Las Vegas, which would eventually become a central hub for Mafia-controlled casinos. Under Luciano's watch, the Mafia's involvement in gambling grew so influential that it would eventually be intertwined with the fabric of American culture. But Luciano wasn't content with just alcohol and gambling. He also recognized the vast potential of labor racketeering, which became one of the most profitable parts of his empire. Labor unions were a massive, untapped resource, and by infiltrating and taking control of key unions, Luciano was able to secure a steady flow of money into his coffers. The Mafia had a long history of infiltrating unions, but Luciano was the first to truly understand the full scale of what could be achieved through this avenue. By controlling the unions, Luciano and his allies were able to extort businesses for protection money, while simultaneously securing labor contracts for Mafia-backed companies. The power of the unions provided the Mafia with enormous leverage, enabling them to control entire industries from construction to shipping. The Mafia's influence over labor unions allowed them to infiltrate every part of American society, making them an omnipresent force that couldn't be ignored. Narcotics was another avenue that Luciano saw as a goldmine. While the older Mafia leaders had shied away from the drug trade, considering it too risky and unpredictable, Luciano saw the potential for enormous profit. The narcotics market, particularly heroin, was starting to emerge as a new frontier in the criminal world, and Luciano was quick to get in on the ground floor. He established ties with international suppliers and began importing drugs into the United States, initially through his extensive network of bootleggers and distributors. His connections with other criminal organizations, both within the United States and abroad, allowed him to build a global network that dealt in everything from heroin to cocaine. Luciano understood that the narcotics trade, while dangerous, offered the kind of massive profits that could sustain the Mafia for decades to come. With these diverse criminal enterprises in place, Luciano's empire was on solid footing. But his brilliance was not just in the scope of the operations, it was in how he kept everything running smoothly. Luciano implemented a system of division of labor that allowed the Mafia to operate like a well-oiled machine. Each family within the Mafia had a specific area of expertise, whether it was bootlegging, gambling, or narcotics. Each faction had its own leaders, but they all reported back to the central power structure that Luciano had established. This division of labor ensured that everyone had a stake in the operation and that no one family or individual could dominate the entire organization. In this way, Luciano was able to keep the peace between rival factions, ensuring that each family had the opportunity to prosper, while maintaining the unity of the larger Mafia empire. Luciano's approach to leadership was rooted in his belief that the Mafia was not just a collection of criminals, it was a family, and like any family there needed to be rules, structure, and order. He knew that in order to maintain control he had to be both a boss and a manager, someone who could balance the different interests of the various factions, while keeping the larger goal in mind. Luciano's ability to build and maintain alliances as well as to eliminate threats and rivals was a key factor in his success. He understood the psychology of loyalty and fear, and he used both to his advantage. The scale of Luciano's empire was unprecedented. His influence stretched across the country from New York to Chicago and even to the West Coast. His operations were so vast and so well organized that they became a model for criminal enterprises around the world. He turned the Mafia into a true business, with all the sophistication, bureaucracy, and organization that came with running a legitimate corporation. His operations were so large and profitable that they attracted the attention of both law enforcement and rival criminals, but Luciano's network was so intricate that it was nearly impossible to infiltrate. Luciano's empire also extended into the realm of politics, where he forged relationships with corrupt politicians, union leaders, and law enforcement officers. His ability to work within the system, to bribe and manipulate those in power, was key to the Mafia's ability to stay one step ahead of the authorities. By controlling key political figures and ensuring that the Mafia had allies within government, Luciano was able to secure protection for his operations and continue to expand his influence. As his empire grew, so did Luciano's power. He became not just a leader of the Mafia, but a symbol of what organized crime could become when it was run like a business. The structure he created allowed the Mafia to operate with unprecedented efficiency, and his influence would continue to shape the criminal world for years to come. However, as with all empires, the higher you rise, the harder you fall. Despite his brilliance in building an organized, profitable criminal empire, Luciano would eventually face the consequences of his actions, as law enforcement and rival factions closed in on him. But during the peak of his power, Luciano had turned the Mafia into an institution, one that would forever change the face of organized crime. The Mafia, by its very nature, is a world of alliances and rivalries, where loyalty is constantly tested and betrayal lurks just beneath the surface. In this world, power is everything, and the struggle to maintain or usurp it is a constant, relentless battle. As Luciano's power expanded, so too did the number of men vying for control. The larger his empire grew, the more complicated the dynamics of power became. It was inevitable that, eventually, Luciano would face the challenge of internal conflict, not just from external forces like law enforcement or rival gangs, but from those closest to him, the very men he had brought into his fold. Allies became enemies, and enemies became allies as Luciano navigated the murky waters of Mafia politics. To understand Luciano's success, one must first understand the complex relationships that define the Mafia world. Unlike traditional businesses, where competition is often a healthy driver of innovation, the Mafia thrived on competition, but only as long as it didn't threaten the core leadership. To Luciano, the key to keeping his empire intact wasn't simply maintaining power, but managing relationships, ensuring that those around him were too invested in the system to destroy it. However, not all of Luciano's relationships were built on mutual respect. Some were built on necessity, others on pragmatism, and still others on raw ambition. A number of Luciano's closest allies were men who were just as ruthless as he was, and who harbored their own aspirations for power. Men like Vito Genovese, who was once one of Luciano's closest confidants, and Frank Costello, who played an essential role in Luciano's rise, would later become the focal point of rivalries that would strain Luciano's rule. At the heart of the Mafia's power structure was the constant tension between loyalty and ambition. This tension was particularly evident in the relationships between Luciano and his closest lieutenants. Men like Genovese and Costello were not just soldiers in Luciano's army, they were ambitious men with their own dreams of power. Luciano understood this dynamic better than anyone, and it was this understanding that allowed him to maintain control for as long as he did. He kept his enemies close but his allies even closer. He played the game of power with a sense of calculated risk, knowing when to make a concession and when to consolidate power. The relationship between Luciano and Vito Genovese was one of the most complex in Mafia history. Genovese, a man known for his quiet demeanor and ambition, was a rising star in the Mafia world. He had earned Luciano's trust and played a pivotal role in his rise to power. However, Genovese was not content with his position as an underling in Luciano's empire. Like many in the Mafia, he believed that loyalty to a boss was important but only up to a point. Eventually, everyone in the Mafia, it seemed, had aspirations of ruling their own empire. Genovese's desire for control eventually led to a break with Luciano, marking the beginning of a deep rivalry between the two men. The tensions between the two men reached a boiling point in the early 1930s, when Genovese attempted to wrest control from Luciano. In 1931, while Luciano was imprisoned, Genovese saw an opportunity to solidify his position within the Mafia. Genovese was instrumental in orchestrating the downfall of Joe Masuria, a rival boss, and he made sure that Luciano's influence was preserved during his time in prison. But the moment Luciano regained his freedom, he was faced with the reality of Genovese's growing ambition. At first, Luciano tried to reconcile with Genovese, understanding that maintaining unity within the Mafia was critical. But Genovese's ambitions could not be contained. He was no longer satisfied with being a subordinate. His attempts to secure more power ultimately led to a break with Luciano. However, Luciano's brilliance as a leader lay in his ability to handle the delicate art of betrayal. He was aware of Genovese's plans and acted quickly, orchestrating a political maneuver that pushed Genovese out of the picture, but without provoking open conflict. He understood that to keep his empire intact, he had to neutralize Genovese without triggering a war within the organization. At the same time, Luciano's relationship with Frank Costello, a man who had been instrumental in helping him build his empire, was equally important. Costello, known as the Prime Minister of the Underworld for his sophisticated and diplomatic style, was a master of negotiation and had played a pivotal role in Luciano's rise. Costello was more focused on managing the political aspects of the Mafia's operations, establishing connections with politicians and law enforcement, than on the street-level violence that characterized much of the Mafia's dealings. But Costello's influence was undeniable, and as Luciano's empire grew, so did his power. Costello's rise was inevitable. He had a knack for making the right connections at the right time, and his smooth-talking demeanor made him invaluable in negotiations. As Luciano's right-hand man, Costello helped broker deals with politicians and businessmen, ensuring that the Mafia was always in the right place at the right time. However, Costello's eventual rift with Luciano was the product of a combination of ambition, personal rivalry, and shifting dynamics in the Mafia. Costello's desire for power became evident as he attempted to carve out his own niche within the Mafia's power structure. While Luciano was content to work in the shadows, Costello wanted more direct control over the family's operations. This led to a slow unraveling of their once strong alliance. While the conflict between Genovese and Luciano was more open and direct, Costello's ambitions were subtler. However, they still posed a serious challenge to Luciano's dominance. As Costello's power grew, Luciano was forced to navigate the shifting allegiances and balance the interests of his various allies. This constant tension between his closest men was a defining feature of Luciano's leadership. He understood that in order to remain at the top, he needed to balance the ambitions of those around him while making sure that no one man became too powerful. The struggle for control did not stop with Genovese and Costello. There were numerous other figures in the Mafia who sought to take advantage of Luciano's increasing isolation. As Luciano faced increasing pressure from law enforcement, particularly the FBI, his hold over the Mafia began to weaken. Rival factions began to grow in strength, each led by men with their own dreams of power. But the real test of Luciano's leadership came in the form of a growing tide of opposition that stemmed from within his own organization. The tensions between Luciano's old allies and rivals ultimately set the stage for his downfall. Luciano's ability to outmaneuver his rivals was legendary. He understood that in the Mafia, the art of survival wasn't about raw power, it was about knowing when to strike and when to retreat. He was a master of subtlety, always thinking several steps ahead of his opponents. But even the most brilliant strategist cannot avoid the inevitable. As time passed, the growing factions within the Mafia, combined with the constant pressure from law enforcement, made it increasingly difficult for Luciano to maintain his grip on power. The Mafia's internal struggles, driven by ambition and betrayal, were at the core of the challenges Luciano faced during the latter part of his reign. It was a delicate balancing act, keeping the peace among his allies while dealing with the outside world's ever-growing threats. In the end, the growing rifts within the Mafia contributed to Luciano's fall from power. His enemies, once allies, had grown strong enough to challenge his authority, and despite his best efforts to maintain control, the foundation of his empire began to crack. The rise of internal rivalries, from Vito Genovese's open ambitions to Frank Costello's quieter pursuit of power, reflected a fundamental truth of organized crime. Power is never truly secure. Even in the most carefully constructed empire, there are always those who seek to undermine the leader. Luciano's downfall was not solely a result of law enforcement's increasing pressure but was deeply tied to the fracturing of his internal alliances. The very system he built, one of loyalty, control, and calculated power, had begun to unravel from within, setting the stage for the collapse of one of the most influential criminal empires in history. Luciano's empire, though vast and meticulously structured, was not impervious to the pressures of both external forces and internal strife. As his criminal empire expanded, so too did the scrutiny from law enforcement, particularly from a determined and relentless J. Edgar Hoover and the newly emerging FBI. For all the strategic brilliance with which Luciano had built his business, there was always the looming threat of the law. The government's desire to dismantle organized crime had grown exponentially in the early 1930s, especially as Prohibition ended and the Mafia's grip on the American underworld tightened. While Luciano had skillfully avoided major legal consequences for much of his rise, there was a shift in the government's approach. The focus was no longer just on the surface-level crimes, bootlegging, gambling, and extortion, but on the systemic control that organized crime had over entire industries and the corrupt political infrastructure. The very complexity that made Luciano's empire so powerful, its vast network, the cooperation between various families, and the extensive corruption it had seeded in politics, also made it an increasing target for law enforcement. The more powerful the Mafia became, the more dangerous it was seen by the state. The state's war on crime was no longer just about busting up small-time bootleggers or gamblers. It was about dismantling a national criminal syndicate with its roots deeply planted in the fabric of American society. The growing FBI pressure, along with the fear of becoming too high-profile, led Luciano to take drastic actions to protect both himself and his empire. For Luciano, survival meant staying a step ahead of the law, but this was easier said than done. With law enforcement growing more sophisticated and more focused on organized crime, the Mafia's ability to operate in the shadows was slowly being chipped away. The authorities had a growing awareness of how deeply entrenched the Mafia was in American life, and they were determined to expose the true scale of its operations. The FBI's pressure on Luciano reached its peak when they used his close relationships with corrupt politicians and law enforcement officers as leverage. The government knew that Luciano was not just a criminal. He was a figure who could influence entire sectors of the economy and political landscape. The Mafia was not only an illegal cartel, it had become an institution in American society, affecting labor unions, businesses, and even elections. With this realization, the government stepped up its efforts to destroy the Mafia's infrastructure. Despite Luciano's careful planning and extensive efforts to maintain his empire's secrecy, the government managed to infiltrate his organization. They used wiretaps, informants, and surveillance to slowly piece together the operations of the Mafia. In addition to law enforcement efforts, Luciano also had to contend with the rising tide of internal betrayal. Men he had trusted were now turning against him, and the shifting dynamics within the Mafia added another layer of complexity to his already precarious position. With internal rivals like Genovese and Costello vying for control, and external pressure from law enforcement mounting, Luciano found himself trapped in a delicate and dangerous situation. In 1936, Luciano's empire finally started to crumble. His arrest was orchestrated in a way that would have devastating consequences for the entire organization. The United States government, through the tireless efforts of the FBI and state law enforcement, had finally gathered enough evidence to charge Luciano. He was arrested on charges of compulsory prostitution, primarily based on his control of the Manhattan brothel network. While the charges seemed relatively straightforward, they were a culmination of years of investigation into his broader criminal activities. They painted a clear picture of Luciano's vast empire of illegal enterprises, from gambling and narcotics to labor racketeering and corruption. The arrest itself was not a sudden event. In many ways, it was the product of a long-running campaign by the government to bring down organized crime. The FBI had been relentless in its pursuit of the Mafia, and Luciano, despite his power and influence, had no way to escape their growing net. The authorities had managed to piece together a substantial case, not just against Luciano himself but against the entire infrastructure of his criminal organization. What followed was a trial that was as dramatic as it was high-profile. The media descended on the proceedings, treating the case as a national spectacle. The courtroom drama became an extension of the larger battle between the state and the Mafia, with Luciano's fate hanging in the balance. Despite his formidable network of lawyers, Luciano was convicted and sentenced to 30 to 50 years in prison. The court's decision was seen as a major victory for law enforcement, a rare and significant blow against the Mafia and its unchecked power. Luciano's arrest was a profound turning point for both him and the Mafia. It marked the beginning of a new chapter in the organization's history, one where the once indomitable kingpin would have to navigate the harsh realities of prison life. But even behind bars, Luciano was not defeated. He had spent his entire career building a network of contacts, and he was still able to wield considerable influence, even in the most restrictive of circumstances. His power behind bars was a testament to his genius as a strategist. He quickly realized that his control over the Mafia could remain intact, as long as he maintained the loyalty of his key allies and kept the operations running smoothly. The Mafia under Luciano's control was not just about street-level operations. It was a business that could function without him physically present. With his contacts still running the day-to-day operations of the Mafia, Luciano was able to maintain a semblance of authority. In many ways he remained the true boss of the organization, with his influence permeating through every level of the operation. Luciano's ability to maintain control from prison was not just about his loyal allies. It was also about his ability to manipulate the system. Even behind bars, he remained a master of politics, using his connections to gain favorable treatment and influence the conditions of his imprisonment. He was able to secure privileges that most prisoners could only dream of, using his power to keep his operations going. Luciano's connections in the political world and his vast network of Mafia operatives helped him remain relevant, even when he was physically removed from the underworld he had built. But as the years wore on, the toll of Luciano's imprisonment began to weigh on him. His health deteriorated, and the isolation from the outside world began to erode his once unquestionable authority. He had come to terms with the fact that his time at the top of the Mafia was coming to an end. But in true Luciano fashion, he had a plan for his future. In 1946, after serving nearly 10 years in prison, Luciano was granted a controversial pardon and was deported to Italy. The pardon was the result of political negotiations, and it marked the end of Luciano's time in the United States. His deportation was part of a larger agreement that involved his cooperation with the U.S. government during and after World War II, specifically in helping the Allied forces with intelligence regarding the Mafia's operations. Luciano's role in assisting the war effort was seen as a way for the government to gain leverage over him, and his deportation was a political maneuver that allowed him to remain alive and free, albeit outside the country he had once ruled. But while Luciano's departure from the United States marked the end of his physical dominance over the Mafia, his influence did not wane. Even in exile, Luciano remained a symbol of power. He continued to communicate with his former allies and influence Mafia operations across the Atlantic. His exile in Italy, however, was not without its struggles. Though he lived comfortably, Luciano's health continued to decline. He lived in a sort of limbo, cut off from the empire he had once controlled, while also feeling the weight of the years and the decisions that had led him there. Luciano's downfall, though marked by legal battles, betrayals, and the physical disintegration of his empire, was not simply a story of a man losing power. It was a story of survival. Even when the walls seemed to close in on him, Luciano managed to adapt and navigate the complexities of his world. His time in prison and subsequent exile were testaments to his ability to maintain control, even when his physical presence was absent. The survival of his empire during this period proved that the Mafia Luciano built had become an institution, one that would continue to thrive in various forms long after his fall from grace. Ultimately, Luciano's story is one of power, betrayal, and the inevitable decline of even the most formidable empires. His rise was swift, his empire vast, but his downfall was inevitable. The forces of law, internal strife, and time all conspired to break the empire he had built. But even in his downfall, Luciano's legacy endured. His innovations in organized crime and his mastery of the system would go on to influence generations of criminals and bosses who followed in his footsteps. And though his reign as the most powerful figure in the Mafia had come to an end, the myth of Lucky Luciano would continue to loom large, casting a long shadow over the world of organized crime for decades to come. The early 1930s were a turbulent time for the Mafia. The streets of New York were filled with the sound of violence, betrayal, and whispers of looming change. Luciano's meteoric rise and control over the underworld had made him a target not just of law enforcement, but also of enemies within his own ranks. Even the very empire he had so carefully constructed, one built on secrecy, loyalty, and a code of silence, was becoming vulnerable. It was during this period of heightened tension that the Mafia's kingpin, Lucky Luciano, faced his first major downfall. The events that led to Luciano's downfall were set into motion by a series of interwoven factors. His growing power, his transformation into a national figure, his entanglement in political corruption, and most importantly, the shifting dynamics of the Mafia. As Luciano rose, so did the stakes. And the higher the stakes, the more ruthless and unpredictable the battle for power became. The collapse of the once unshakable empire began with a betrayal that cut to the heart of the Mafia structure and signaled the unraveling of Luciano's reign. At the center of the storm was the relationship between Luciano and his former ally, Salvatore Maranzano. Maranzano had once been a powerful figure in the Mafia world, but his traditionalist approach to the business had begun to clash with Luciano's more modern, innovative tactics. Maranzano was a member of the old guard, a man who adhered to the old ways of doing business, the way of the Sicilian Mafia with its rigid hierarchy, code of conduct, and territorial battles. Luciano, however, was focused on creating a unified organization, one that functioned like a corporation with clear divisions of labor and, above all, a centralized control that would reduce the infighting and chaos that had plagued the Mafia for decades. The tension between Luciano and Maranzano came to a head in 1931, with what would become known as the Castellamarese War. The war, which had its roots in the shifting power dynamics of the Mafia, was a brutal conflict between the forces loyal to Luciano and those loyal to Maranzano. For Luciano, the war represented not just a fight for control over the underworld, but a chance to reshape the Mafia into something more organized, more profitable, and more powerful. Maranzano, on the other hand, stood as a symbol of the old world, a world that Luciano knew was quickly becoming obsolete. The two men were fundamentally at odds in their vision for the Mafia's future. As the war raged on, the stakes grew higher. The violence was unimaginable, bombings, shootings, and assassinations became the everyday currency of the conflict. But Luciano's vision for the future of the Mafia was clear. He was willing to risk it all to reshape the organization in his own image. And so, he made a series of strategic alliances with rival gangsters, including the powerful Genovese family, in order to neutralize Maranzano and his supporters. The war came to a bloody climax when, in the fall of 1931, Luciano's men ambushed Maranzano in his office, assassinating him in a move that would solidify Luciano's control over the Mafia and mark the official end of the Castellamarese War. But the consequences of Maranzano's death were far-reaching. While Luciano's victory was decisive, it was not without its costs. The assassination, which was carried out with the utmost precision and secrecy, sent shockwaves through the Mafia and the criminal underworld. It marked the beginning of a new era, but also signaled the fragility of Luciano's empire. His actions in killing Maranzano, while necessary for his survival and ultimate success, planted the seeds for a much larger and more dangerous battle, the fight for dominance within the organization itself. Luciano's decision to have Maranzano killed did not go unnoticed. In fact, it set a precedent for how the Mafia would operate in the future. Power would be taken, not earned. Luciano's actions were as much about survival as they were about asserting dominance. But as the saying goes, power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Luciano's growing control over the Mafia attracted rivals, and with the rivalries came the inevitable betrayal. The most dangerous of these rivals was his own former ally, Vito Genovese. Like many men who had worked with Luciano in the past, Genovese had seen Luciano's rise to power as an opportunity to advance his own position. Genovese had initially been one of Luciano's most trusted lieutenants, and the two men had a close, even familial relationship. But as Luciano's power grew, so too did Genovese's ambitions. Genovese, who had always been known for his quiet ambition and ruthlessness, saw an opportunity to replace Luciano at the top of the Mafia. Genovese's betrayal was not an impulsive act, it was carefully calculated. He knew that Luciano's empire, despite its brilliance, was not invulnerable. With the increasing pressure from law enforcement, the shifting power dynamics within the Mafia, and the growing dissatisfaction among the rank and file, Genovese believed that it was the right time to make his move. He attempted to organize a coup, hoping to topple Luciano and seize control of the Mafia for himself. But Luciano was no fool. He had anticipated that a man of Genovese's ambition would eventually challenge him for dominance. The two men clashed in a battle for control, and once again Luciano's ability to read the situation and act decisively came into play. He was able to outmaneuver Genovese, who, while still a major player, was not yet powerful enough to dethrone Luciano. The betrayal, though, left an indelible mark on Luciano. It was a reminder that power, no matter how carefully managed, always comes at a price. The seeds of future discontent had been planted, and with each passing day, the cracks in Luciano's empire grew wider. Despite these challenges, Luciano's true downfall was not the result of a singular betrayal or internal rivalry. It was, instead, the culmination of years of relentless pressure from both law enforcement and rival factions within the Mafia. The government's war on organized crime was intensifying, and Luciano, despite his ability to manage and manipulate the system, could no longer avoid the inevitable. The federal government's relentless pursuit of Luciano, coupled with the growing internal conflicts, eventually led to his downfall. In 1936, after years of legal battles, Luciano was finally arrested. The charges against him were not just about the crimes he had committed, bootlegging, gambling, labor racketeering, but about his leadership of a vast and highly organized criminal enterprise. The authorities had managed to gather enough evidence to convict Luciano on charges of compulsory prostitution, and the trial was a media spectacle. It was not just a criminal trial, it was a public spectacle, a showdown between the forces of law and the underworld. The jury's decision to convict Luciano was a significant moment in American history, one that would shake the very foundation of organized crime. But Luciano's arrest was not the end of his influence. Even from behind bars, he continued to control his empire, maintaining his influence over his underworld network through intermediaries. He became a symbol of Mafia power, even as he languished in prison. The trial, while a victory for law enforcement, failed to completely dismantle the Mafia Luciano had built. The men who had once worked for him continued to follow his orders, and his power, though diminished, still held sway over the criminal underworld. The climax of Luciano's story came not in his downfall, but in his eventual pardon and deportation to Italy. The U.S. government, in an effort to secure Luciano's cooperation during World War II, granted him a controversial pardon. The political maneuvering that led to his release was a reflection of the larger, more complex world of criminal enterprise Luciano had helped build. His deportation to Italy marked the end of his physical presence in the American underworld, but his legacy as one of the most influential figures in organized crime would continue to cast a long shadow. Luciano's downfall, though inevitable, was not simply the result of external pressures or internal betrayals. It was the culmination of a long and turbulent journey, one that saw the rise of a man from humble beginnings to the undisputed king of organized crime. Luciano's story is one of ambition, power, betrayal, and survival. It's a testament to the fragility of even the most powerful empires and a reminder of the unpredictable nature of the criminal underworld. The fall of Lucky Luciano was not the end of the Mafia, but it was a significant chapter in its long and storied history. Even as the king of the underworld fell, his influence and legacy endured, shaping the future of organized crime for generations to come. As the criminal empire built by Lucky Luciano faced the inevitable consequences of law enforcement scrutiny, internal strife, and the shifting tides of power, Luciano's personal journey took a dramatic turn with his conviction and sentencing in 1936. This chapter in Luciano's life would mark the culmination of years of tension, conflict, and betrayal, but it would also lay the groundwork for a new phase of his life, one that would be just as complex, yet profoundly different. Luciano's trial, which became a media spectacle, was a pivotal moment in the history of organized crime in America. By the time he was arrested, Luciano had already risen from an unknown street thug to the undisputed leader of the most powerful criminal empire in the country. His legal troubles were the result of years of investigations by law enforcement, which had managed to piece together an elaborate case against him. The charges that led to his arrest were largely based on his involvement in managing and running a series of brothels through which women were coerced into prostitution. The government had collected a mountain of evidence detailing Luciano's involvement in organized crime, including bootlegging, gambling, and labor racketeering, but it was the case of compulsory prostitution that ultimately sealed his fate. The trial was a high-profile affair, with Luciano's reputation as a powerful crime boss drawing public and media attention. The courtroom proceedings were dramatic, as Luciano's legal team fought to discredit the evidence and argue for his innocence. But despite their efforts, Luciano was convicted on charges of compulsory prostitution in 1936 and sentenced to a lengthy prison term. The trial served as a symbolic victory for law enforcement, signaling the state's ability to bring down one of the most powerful figures in organized crime. However, Luciano's conviction and subsequent sentence were far from the end of his influence. Even in prison, Luciano remained a powerful figure in the criminal world. His network of loyal operatives, including key figures who had once worked closely with him, ensured that his reach extended far beyond the prison walls. Luciano's ability to maintain control, even from behind bars, was a testament to his genius as a strategist and leader. He continued to manage his criminal empire through intermediaries, ensuring that his business operations remained profitable and that the Mafia's influence continued to grow. While Luciano's days as a visible hands-on boss of the Mafia were over, he was still able to influence the organization's activities. His prison term in many ways marked the beginning of a new phase in his leadership. He was no longer able to oversee day-to-day operations or engage in the kind of strategic meetings that had once been the hallmark of his success, but his network of allies ensured that his vision for the future of organized crime remained intact. Despite his imprisonment, Luciano's power remained formidable, largely because of his control over key figures within the Mafia. His reach extended beyond just the underworld. He maintained influence over corrupt politicians, union leaders, and law enforcement officers, using his extensive network to secure certain privileges for himself. From his cell, Luciano continued to pull strings, manipulating the system to his advantage. It was clear that while he was physically confined, his mind remained as sharp as ever. However, the realities of prison life began to take a toll on Luciano. His health began to deteriorate, and the weight of the years, combined with the political and personal struggles, began to erode the sharpness that had once made him an unstoppable force. His position as the undisputed leader of the Mafia was slowly being challenged, not only by law enforcement but also by internal rivalries within the organization. But in the face of these challenges, Luciano found a way to survive. His prison sentence, while a significant blow, was not the end of his legacy. In fact, it marked the beginning of an entirely new chapter for him, one where survival, adaptation, and diplomacy would become his primary tools. Luciano's resilience during his time in prison spoke volumes about his character, and his ability to influence events from behind bars would become a defining feature of his story.